I get a lot of requests for the Dornian Heresy. So I thought it's time to finally relent. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the DH, it's essentially an alternate history Warhammer 40k. In this timeline, the legions that became traitorous in the original timeline remained loyal, and those who we know as being loyal fell to chaos, with the exception of the Ultramarines who became secessionists. Among the traitors in this universe are, of course, the Imperial Fist, who are essentially the equivalent of the Black Legion. So when I received this review copy of Fafnir Rann from Games Workshop, I knew exactly which chapter to tackle. But before I could continue to wage my one-man war against the Imperial Fist fans, I had to remove the components from the sprue and clean them up of any mold lines and sprue tabs. Oh, I'll be giving this guide 4 dead ammo bits out of 5. There won't be any sculpting, but there are quite a few components and other kits, and a lot of adjustments to be made. The first of these came in the form of the chest piece. Being quite ornate with Imperial details, it would look a little out of place on a Chaos Space Marine, so it had to be removed. I began by carefully shaving back the surface with a few small knife cuts. With most of the laurel removed, I just needed to smooth back the armour and remove any remaining trace of the detailing. I performed a kind of shaving technique to gradually flatten out the surface. This technique was also repeated on the emblems on the lower section of the armour. I just made sure to not accidentally trim back the beading around the edge of the armour as I did so. While the Imperial Fists in the DH universe follow Chaos Undivided, I decided to dedicate this particular version of Fafnir to Khorne. Carrying 2 giant axes kind of made this one an obvious choice. To make this even more clear, I decided to attach his tilt shield from the Skull Crushers of Khorne set. But first, I need to make a few small adjustments. I began by shaving back the rear of the shield, removing the small tab. In addition to this, I also trimmed back the front of the armour around the waist before gluing the shield into place. Before I could assemble the torso, I first needed to remove some of the aquilers from the parts of the model, such as the shin pads I have here. These were removed in the same way as before. Then the legs were assembled and glued to the torso. Similarly, the aquilers were also removed from the forearms before the arms were also glued to the torso. The next Chaos modification to make to the Marine were the shoulder pads. These were taken from the regular Chaos Marine kit. However, after a quick comparison, I couldn't quite fit these pads against the arms. The arms had these small tabs that caused the pads to sit at an odd angle. As a result, these needed to be reduced. I trimmed them back with a knife and made a few comparisons as I went along. Once I was happy with how the shoulders were fitting, I glued them into place. When it came to adding the axes, I had a few ideas of what to do with them, such as adding skulls, chains and symbols. But ultimately I felt that the axes were big enough and imposing enough to work as they are. However, just to give them a slightly more chaotic flair, I opted to add some nicks and damage to the blade's edges. I achieved this by using my razor sword to make the initial perpendicular cuts into the edge of the blade. With these done, I could expand them out and add a few shallow cuts with my knife. This was repeated on the second axe, resulting in a more jagged, brutal looking set of weapons. Now of course, this wouldn't be a Khorne conversion if I didn't include some dead animal bits, specifically some skulls for the Skull Throne. These were taken from the usual place, the Citadel skull set, but I couldn't use them as they were. In order to attach them to the waist without them protruding too far, I first had to clip away the back half of the skulls, which I then proceeded to clean up. These skulls were then glued in the empty space on Fafnir's waist. These not only helped to bulk out the model a little bit, but also built up that Khorne appearance. To balance out the other side of the waist, I simply took one of the pouches from the Fafnir kit and cut it in half in order to slim it down a little bit. After cleaning up the pouch, I glued this onto the waist as well. Fafnir's backpack also came with some distinctly Imperial looking detailing, which would need to be replaced. But first I had to clip away the banner pole, getting as close to the surface of the backpack as possible. Any remaining plastic was then trimmed away. With this done, the power pack could be assembled. The replacement for this pole needed to be suitably cornate, and so I sourced it from the Skull Reaper's kit. This comes with an excellent assortment of banner poles to use, but I settled on this particular one with the 3 mounted skulls. It was a little too tall though, so I made a cut just below the middle bar. I flattened out the cut in order to make a better bond and also trimmed back the small trinket just a little bit. With these adjustments, the banner pole was then glued to the top of the power pack. The final piece of the puzzle was the head. Instead of opting for Fafnir's glorious facial hair, I instead took a suitably chaotic head from the Chaos Chosen kit, but pretty much any Chaos Space Marine head would work well here. However, as the neck didn't feature the usual rounded socket, I had to cut and clip away the bulk of the neck in order to drastically reduce the height. After I checked and was happy with the fit, I glued the neck into place. With the model complete, I could work on the base. For this, I chose to use my usual cork floor tiles that were torn up and superglued down to the base to create a rocky outcrop. This was then further decorated with some more skulls and then a little texture paint, just enough to fill in any remaining gaps. The model was almost ready to be painted, but needed a little more prep first. I drilled a hole into the inside of the backpack and into the foot. Into both of these holes I superglued some 1mm steel wire. For the backpack, I intended this wire to be a holder to allow me to more easily paint the pack separately from the model. For the wire in the foot, this would be used in conjunction with another hole that I had drilled into and through the base. I joined up the model with the base and used the wire to firmly secure everything along with a little superglue. I clipped away any wire that extended past the base, and with that, the model was ready to be painted. The first step in painting the Mini was the ever important primer step. I wanted to start with a dark base coat that I could build upon. I chose to use some of Pro-Acryl's black-brown primer for this. Its dark brown colour would help to create a dirty and battle-worn appearance to the armour. I used this through my airbrush and didn't need to use much in the way of thinner to get it to the right consistency, and I used about 30 psi and a 0.4mm nozzle. Once this was done, I not only had a much better surface to apply my paint to, but I also had the perfect starting colour. Following the base coat, I then added some of Tamiya's XF-2 white to my reservoir, along with a little thinner. This paint works really well through an airbrush and allows you to get some nice smooth coverage. I use this paint as a Zenithal highlight, spraying the paint from above so that it built up over the upper areas, but it didn't touch the recesses. By keeping these areas as the dark primer, they would appear as shadows and help to bring out some of the details. From here, I then sprayed some Yriel Yellow across the armour. By keeping my layers here thin, the shading achieved in the previous step still showed through. After the first application dried, I continued to build up the layers until I achieved a good solid yellow colour. While I had a good starting point for the shading in the recesses, it was looking a little flat, so I directly sprayed some Seraphim Sepia. This was added into the airbrush without any thinner and helped to gently darken down some of those shaded areas. With the shading achieved, I next wanted to bring out some of the details with some highlights of Yriel Yellow. This was carefully used to pick out the edges of the armour, leaving behind a thin line of yellow. The only problem with spraying it over the white was that the yellow had lost some of its warmth and had an almost green hue to it. To bring back some of this warmth, I created a mixture of Iyanden Yellow and Contrast Medium. When applied over the surfaces, it acted as a glaze and just subtly adjusted the tone, bringing back some of that warmth. While the yellow was perfect for representing the Imperial Fist, it was far too pristine for a warrior who had fallen to chaos. To give it a little wear and tear, I used some Rhinox hide and a fine-tipped brush to add some small flecks across the armour edges and details. This reddish brown would give these chips and dents a rusted appearance, building up the worn effect of the armour. The final step in painting the yellow armour was to add some small lines of the light Dorn Yellow around the Rhinox hide flecks. Once again, I used a fine-tipped brush and very carefully painted fine lines beneath some of the flecks. This created a kind of 3D effect on the surface, giving them the illusion of depth. From here, I could begin to tackle the other areas of the model. Starting out with the base coat, I painted the armour trim, metal areas and leather using some Abaddon Black, making sure to mix in a little water and apply a couple of thin layers to get a good solid base coat. For the various skulls, I chose to use some Zandri Dust to give them a dark bone colour. The leather tassets and the wrappings around the axes were base coated with Gal Vorbak Red, before finishing off the base coats by painting the exposed head with some Rakarth Flesh. With the base coats laid down, I could begin applying the highlights. The first was applied to the armour trim. I used some dark Eshin Grey to pick out the sharp edges and raised details. Dawnstone was then used to just tackle the upper edges. With it being a lighter tone, it helped to create the impression that light was falling predominantly on these upper areas. Finally, an extreme highlight of Administratrum Grey was applied to the corners and sharper points such as the rivets. Painting these with a very light grey gave them much more sharpness and allowed them to stand out even more. For the red leather areas, I started off first with a highlight of Mephiston Red. Much like the earlier Iyanden Yellow, I then applied a thin layer of Blood Angel's Red to the leather, giving it a much richer red colour, before finishing off with an extreme highlight of Fire Dragon Bright. Before I began highlighting the skulls though, I decided to give them a wash of Agrax Earthshade. This just helped to darken down some of the recesses, which would allow my later highlights to really stand out. After allowing the wash to dry, I then began my highlights, starting out with some Ushabti Bone. This was then finished off with a few small well-placed spots of white scar, which brought me to the head. When it comes to painting flesh, subtle highlights tend to work better, so I began with an initial highlight of Pallid Wych Flesh, using it to pick out the various facial features. From here, I could then apply yet another contrast paint glaze using some Guilliman Flesh. This flowed into the recesses to give them an ever so slightly darker shade. It also helped to blend in the previous highlights, smoothing them into the base coat. A second contrast paint, Blood Angel's Red, was then used to give a little extra colour to the skin. I targeted this directly into some of the recesses. By mixing in some contrast medium, it drastically reduced the strength of the paint and allowed me much greater control over how strong I wanted the red to appear on the model. I finished things off with one final highlight of Pallid Wych Flesh. The final areas of the model to paint were the metallics. As the rest of the model was quite bright, I opted for a slightly darker metallic for my base coat, Iron Warriors. This was painted over the axes, the spikes, and some of the smaller details like the vents and decorative items. Following this, some Agrax Earthshade was applied. This not only helped to shade the metal recesses, but also gave them a slightly rusted and dirted appearance. While the Agrax Earthshade had created a bit of dirt and grime, I decided to push it even further over the axe with some Gore Grunta Fur. I targeted this directly into a few of the recesses and along the back part of the blade's edges. The metallics were then finished off with a fine edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. But this model wouldn't be complete without some blood and gore. To create some finely chopped flesh lumps to go alongside my blood, I mixed in a little typhus corrosion into my blood for the blood god. Alternatively, something like stolen mud could be used instead. Essentially, you want the texture and a slightly darker tone. This mixture was then brushed onto the blades and was applied much more as a thick paste rather than a paint. This just ensured that the texture was built up nicely. After giving the gore a chance to dry, I then took a torn piece of foam sponge and dipped it into some more blood for the blood god. The sponge was then dabbed along the edge of the blade, the irregular shape of the foam creating random flecks and patterns across the metal. To paint the rocks on the base, I mixed up some watered down Jokaero Orange and applied a couple of coats to give it a solid base colour, making sure to get into all of those recesses as I did so. The skulls on the base were painted in an identical manner to those on the model. I began with a Zandri Dust base coat, followed by some Agrax Earthshade. However, instead of just targeting the skulls, I applied this wash over the whole base. Once the wash had dried, the skulls were highlighted with some Ushabti Bone. To give the base a much more realistic ground texture and to help blend the base into the rest of the model, I grabbed myself some medium rust and some light rust pigment from MIG. Using an old brush, I applied the dusty pigment across the whole base, starting with the medium rust, then followed by the light rust, making sure to get into all the recesses in the rocks and around the skulls. You have to go a little heavier with this particular step because when you apply a varnish, you'll find that the pigment loses its intensity a bit. In addition to applying this to the base, I also brushed it around the bottom of the model. focusing mainly around the feet and the lower legs. These small steps go a long way to tie the model into the location that you're trying to depict them on. With the pigment applied, I could go ahead and varnish the model so the paintwork was protected and the pigment was fixed in place. I did this through an airbrush, but an aerosol spray works too. Just make sure that your first coat is very light. You don't want to saturate the pigment with the varnish, as it will lose that dusty effect. So, lightly apply your first layer, give it a chance to dry, and then build up the varnish steadily. As I'd used a matte varnish, some of the glossiness of the blood had been lost. So more was added across the blades using that same flecking technique. I also took this opportunity to add some blood to the skulls and in spots across the forearms and the chest. Which left me with this. And here we have the completed Dornian Heresy version of Fafnir Rann. It's been a long time coming, but I'm glad that I've finally taken the plunge into this alternate history 40k universe. Creating something that was both chaotic, but still recognisable as being an Imperial Fist was quite tricky, as I didn't want to just look like a regular Chaos Marine who decided to paint himself yellow. I'd love to hear what you thought about this guide, and if you have any ideas for other Dornian Heresy conversions that you'd like to see me tackle in future videos, then do let me know in the comments below. I'll include all the paint sheets in this guide in the description, along with some affiliate links. So if you're looking to try out some of these things yourself, whilst also supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Seth Sewell, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliate links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the tools and paints required to create these conversion guides for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.